18 October 2017. Just after dawn, money began moving in ways no system should allow, and it was only the first ripple of something far bigger moving beneath the surface. By the time investigators finally connected the dots, the numbers were almost unreal. Tens of millions drained through a glitch, millions more stolen through a fake website, and billions hidden in Bitcoin across Europe, forming what would become one of the most extraordinary fraud landscapes the UK has ever faced. This video is about a multi-billion-pound web of deception, how it grew in silence, and how police teams from Lancashire, Avon and Somerset and the Metropolitan Police spent years pulling apart networks that were never meant to be found. Welcome to UK Crime Documentaries. Let's get straight into the case. In October 2017, James Parker was living in a modest flat in Blackpool, the kind of place that gave no hint of what was unfolding inside. There, Parker spent hours studying the cryptocurrency markets, especially an Australian exchange called CoinSpot. One morning, he spotted something that didn't fit. A deposit he'd made appeared to show twice. Then, after a few more tries, the balance shifted again, slightly higher than it should have been. Each test led to the same pattern. A flaw buried deep inside the exchange's software was allowing him to withdraw Bitcoin he had never bought. What began as a curious flicker on his screen soon turned into a routine. By late autumn, he was no longer working exclusively from the Blackpool flat. He shifted to a hotel room in Fleetwood, a short taxi ride away. With the frequent increased withdrawals, the totals were now climbing into the tens of millions. Parker alone was pulling out around £15 million in Bitcoin. But Parker soon realized he couldn't move this amount of money alone, and that's when he began bringing others into the fold. He didn't need a large network, just people he trusted enough to follow instructions without asking too many questions. The first was Kelly Caton, someone whose circumstances looked nothing like the numbers that were about to appear in her accounts. She received Bitcoin directly from Parker, small amounts at first, then larger transfers that quickly added up. By the time the pattern settled, Caton had benefited by around £2.7 million, money she immediately began converting and withdrawing. The speed of the movements alone suggested she knew the source wasn't legitimate, but she continued regardless. Alongside her was Jordan Robinson, another friend drawn into the scheme. His role mirrored Caton's: receive Bitcoin, move it on, turn it into cash as quickly as possible. He ultimately walked away with around £1.7 million, confident that the complexity of cryptocurrency would keep his involvement hidden. Like Caton, he kept communication brief, relying on encrypted apps and avoiding anything that might link him back to Parker through traditional channels. But the most significant addition was Boyes, a financial advisor with enough knowledge of the system to push the money further. We will talk about him in a few minutes. Across the group, patterns emerged: transactions broken into smaller amounts, quick conversions into cash, and deliberate attempts to avoid leaving clear trails. It was controlled, quiet, and designed to look fragmented. But one moment disrupted that illusion, when Carton contacted police claiming her daughter had stolen Bitcoin. That became the first crack in their downfall, and we will talk about this in a few minutes. Apart from their efforts to keep the operation quiet and contained, the sudden spike in wealth was becoming harder to hide. And soon, the way they spent it would draw even more attention than the way they'd made it. In Blackpool, Parker gained a quiet reputation as a Bitcoin millionaire. He bought cars for people he barely knew, sometimes for individuals he happened to speak to only once. On other days, he handed out £5,000 gift vouchers to strangers, the kind of gesture that drew attention long before anyone understood where the funds had come from. The spending didn't stop there. Parker moved into hotels for extended stays, covering bills with ease and treating the spaces as temporary bases while he continued exploiting the glitch. When he wasn't at the hotel bar, He was in jewelry shops or high-end stores, picking up watches, gold, and even smaller luxuries. One of them, a £600 wine cooler, bought without hesitation. The others followed a similar pattern. Caton and Robinson withdrew large amounts of cash, bought expensive items, and made purchases completely out of step with their normal means. Caton, who had been living on an income of less than £10,000 a year, was suddenly moving money that far exceeded anything she had legally earned. Meanwhile, Parker's own totals kept climbing. His personal withdrawals passed £15 million, and when combined with the amounts taken by his inner circle, the total benefit of the fraud pushed beyond £20 to £21 million. None of it matched their lifestyles only months earlier, but for a time, they believed the sudden wealth would go unquestioned, that the glitch would remain theirs alone. As the scale of the withdrawals grew, Parker turned increasingly to the one person in his circle who claimed to understand how to move large amounts of cryptocurrency without attracting attention. Stephen Boyes, a financial advisor who presented himself as someone who could sort out the money. To the group, he was the professional, the one who knew how to turn digital assets into something that wouldn't raise questions. Boyes began receiving significant amounts of illicit Bitcoin directly from Parker. From there, he spread the funds through a series of transfers, breaking them into smaller sums and sending them through multiple exchanges and accounts. Each step was designed to make the origins harder to trace, layering the transactions to obscure their connection to CoinSpot. Wallets were opened and abandoned, new paths created, and accounts moved across platforms, all in an effort to hide the scale of the operation. His involvement went further. Boyes traveled to somewhere not mentioned in the sources to meet a contact who claimed they could handle substantial volumes of Bitcoin, offering a route to convert the crypto into usable currency with minimal scrutiny. This contact also facilitated property opportunities, and Boyes attempted to channel the illegal funds into a villa purchase. As part of that attempt, there was evidence of a £60,000 bribe aimed at securing documents and smoothing the process, another signal of how far the group was willing to go to turn their digital gains into physical assets. Throughout this period, Boyes reassured Parker and the others that everything was under control. But behind the confidence was a trail of movements that grew harder to disguise. As each transaction added weight to the story, none of them could fully contain. The turning point, as we discussed earlier, came from a phone call. Kelly Caton contacted police, claiming her daughter had stolen 15 Bitcoin from her. At the time, officers knew enough about cryptocurrency to recognize that 15 BTC was not a casual amount. Even in 2018 values, it was significant. The question wasn't whether a theft had occurred, but how Caton had come to possess that volume in the first place. Her declared income was modest, well under £10,000 a year, and nothing in her financial history explained holdings of that scale. It was the first visible crack in a scheme that had otherwise managed to stay out of sight. Once that concern was logged, officers began looking at Caton's wider financial activity. Transactions were larger than expected, movements inconsistent with her background, and there were signs of spending that simply didn't match her legitimate means. Attention then broadened to those around her, including Jordan Robinson and James Parker, both of whom showed similar unexplained changes in wealth. None of them could provide a believable source for the funds appearing in their accounts. What started as a query about missing Bitcoin became an investigation into the group's collective finances. With that confirmation, the investigation expanded into a coordinated cross-border effort. The case was given a name, Project Eucalyptus, reflecting both its origins and the international framework now attached to it. Lancashire Police contacted authorities in Australia, where CoinSpot was headquartered, and also reached out to Finnish investigators who were already familiar with crypto-related tracing methods. When CoinSpot reviewed the accounts linked to the transactions, the scale of the problem emerged. They confirmed massive fraudulent withdrawals, far exceeding anything legitimate users would be able to withdraw, all pointing to a systemic manipulation rather than a simple user error. With the scale finally exposed, it was only a matter of time before the network collapsed and each member faced the consequences. As investigators pieced together the movements of money and the routes used to extract it, the case moved steadily toward prosecution. But before it reached court, the man at the center of the fraud was no longer alive to face it. James Parker died in January 2021. His death, the circumstances of which were not publicly disclosed, meant he never answered questions about the glitch, the withdrawals, or the network that had formed around him. With the main defendant gone, the center of the case shifted entirely to the people he had brought into the scheme. As all of the other defendants were already arrested, the Crown Prosecution Service continued with charges against Kelly Caton, Jordan Robinson, Stephen Boys, and James Austin Beddoes. All four had converted those assets into cash, goods, or attempted laundering routes. Their charges reflected that involvement: money laundering, possessing criminal property, and offences linked directly to the exploitation of the exchange. Forensic cryptoanalysis traced every transfer the group made. Even Austin Beddoes, whose role was smaller, had received and moved illicit Bitcoin on Parker's instruction. Blockchain tracing allowed officers to reconstruct the entire flow of funds, a digital record that remained intact long after the money itself had gone. By the time the charges were laid, the network had collapsed entirely. All that remained was the digital evidence and four defendants facing the consequences of a scheme that had unraveled far beyond their control. When the case finally reached Preston Crown Court on the 13th of January 2023, the scale of the fraud and the clarity of the evidence left little room for doubt. Each defendant was sentenced according to the part they played in the operation. Stephen Boys received 6 years in prison. Kelly Caton was sentenced to 4.5 years. Jordan Robinson received the same 4.5-year term for his role. And James Austin Beddoes was given 18 months, suspended for a year. But the sentences were only part of the outcome. What set this case apart was the recovery of assets on a scale rarely seen in UK financial investigations. Officers seized 445 Bitcoin, originally obtained through the fraud. What had been worth around £22 million at the time of the arrests. Through confiscation orders and civil recovery proceedings, authorities ensured the Australian exchange CoinSpot, the primary victim, was compensated in full. Large sums were also recovered from Parker's estate, Boys, Caton and Robinson, with each ordered to repay the value of the assets they still held. But while investigators in Lancashire were untangling a glitch that should never have happened, another kind of fraud was already operating in silence. One built not on a mistake in a system, but on a perfect imitation of it. It didn't start with a breach or a technical failure. It started with a web page, one that looked identical to a site millions of people trusted every day. Jake Lee, 38, and James Heppel, 42, spent years constructing a near-perfect clone of blockchain.com, the platform used worldwide to store and transfer cryptocurrency. To an ordinary user, the difference was invisible. The logo, the layout, the buttons, even the way the pages loaded, everything appeared exactly as it should. And that was the point. The purpose of the clone was simple: get people to hand over their login details and recovery phrases, the very information that protected their digital wallets. Once a victim entered those credentials, believing they were logging into the real site, Lee and Heppel had everything they needed. The access was immediate, the withdrawals were instant, and the cryptocurrency was gone before most people realized anything had happened. The scam operated quietly, without the dramatic movements or sudden spending patterns seen in other cases. There were no public displays of wealth and no obvious indicators linking the fraud to the two men behind it. Instead, it grew slowly, sustained by the trust victims placed in a website they believed was genuine. Over time, the operation reached far beyond the UK. Investigators would later confirm victims in 26 different countries, each one drawn in by a site that looked legitimate in every respect. By the time authorities were able to track the flow of stolen funds, the losses had reached more than £5.7 million, affecting at least 55 identified victims. Every pound taken had followed the same path, what we have just discussed. But once the website was running and the stolen credentials began to flow in, the next challenge was moving the money without being seen. When investigators eventually reached the financial trail behind the fake website, they found a system built on careful movement rather than sudden displays of wealth. Jake Lee had structured the flow of money in a way that aimed to avoid attention, shifting between cash, cryptocurrency, and physical assets with a deliberate pattern. One of the first significant discoveries came when officers executed a search and Lee voluntarily handed over a suitcase containing £551,000 in cash, a moment that revealed just how much had passed through his hands. Further searches uncovered £835,000 in cash in total, along with around £64,000 in cryptocurrency traced directly to the stolen funds. But cash wasn't the only place the money went. Among the seized items was a Banksy bomb love print, valued at roughly £60,000, purchased as part of a growing collection of assets that investigators believed formed part of the laundering strategy. 3 cars were also recovered, each acquired during the period of the fraud, adding to the picture of money being diverted into items that could later be sold or transferred with less scrutiny than digital currency. Both Lee and Heppel used a network of layered cryptocurrency wallets, moving funds repeatedly between addresses to complicate the tracing process. The transfers created long chains that appeared fractured on the blockchain, but ultimately led back to the same set of beneficiaries. From those wallets, money was frequently converted back into cash, withdrawn in structured, lower value amounts to avoid automated banking alerts or suspicion from financial institutions. But each transfer, withdrawal, and purchase left a record, and those records would eventually form the backbone of the case against them. As the losses mounted and complaints from victims across multiple countries reached police, cybercrime investigators began assembling the digital fragments left behind by the operation. The breakthrough came through a combination of IP analysis, account monitoring, and blockchain tracing, which gradually pulled separate strands of activity back toward the same small cluster of users. The wallets receiving stolen cryptocurrency, once believed to be unconnected, showed repeated links to locations, devices, and online behavior associated with Jake Lee and James Heppel. Jake Lee, identified as the primary architect behind the clone website and the movement of the stolen funds. His role in designing the fraudulent platform, harvesting victims' credentials, and controlling the transfer and conversion of cryptocurrency placed him at the center of the operation. James Heppel's involvement was significant but less extensive. Despite the difference in their roles, both were held accountable for participating in a fraud that stretched across borders and impacted victims in more than 24 countries. Once the pattern was clear, officers moved in. Both men were arrested. The strength of the digital proof meant there was little room for alternative explanations. Faced with the weight of that evidence, both men entered guilty pleas. They admitted conspiracy to commit fraud, acknowledging their roles in designing and running the website used to harvest victims' credentials. They also pleaded guilty to possessing criminal property and converting criminal property, reflecting both the stolen cryptocurrency itself and the cash, assets, and withdrawals that followed. In court, the prosecution emphasized the sophistication of the operation. When the case reached Bristol Crown Court on the 3rd of May 2024, the sentencing reflected both the scale of the fraud and the level of involvement each man had in carrying it out. Throughout the proceedings, police described the case as a highly technical cyber-enabled fraud, one that required extensive digital tracing, forensic wallet analysis, and coordinated international cooperation to unravel. The sentencing and confiscation hearings marked the final stage of a long investigation and demonstrated how even sophisticated online scams can be dismantled when the evidence is allowed to speak for itself. Jake Lee received a 4-year prison sentence, whereas James Heppel was sentenced to 15 months imprisonment. Following the custodial sentences, the court imposed confiscation orders to recover the proceeds of the crime. Lee was ordered to repay close to £1 million, a figure based on the assets traced to him, including cash, cryptocurrency, vehicles, and valuable artwork. Failure to pay within the set time frame would result in a default prison term, adding further years to his sentence. Heppel was ordered to repay approximately £140,000. He was given a 3-month deadline to make the payment. If he failed to do so, he would face an additional 18 months of imprisonment, reflecting the seriousness with which the court treated the financial recovery process. Yet even this highly technical scam was small compared to the investigation waiting ahead, one that would take police into the world of multi-billion-pound cryptocurrency crime. The story began long before the UK ever knew her name. In 2014, Ximin Qian established a business in China called Lantian, translated as Blue Sky. On the surface, it appeared to be an investment company offering high-yield products in a fast-growing financial market. What drew people in were the promises: returns of up to 300%, guaranteed growth, and an assurance that their money was being placed in legitimate, high-performing portfolios. Word spread quickly. Families invested together, pensioners put in their savings, and workers contributed wages they could not afford to lose. Over time, more than 128,000 people became part of the scheme. But Blue Sky was never what it pretended to be. Behind the polished image and confident messaging, Qian was funneling the money into cryptocurrency exchanges, converting vast sums into Bitcoin and moving it far from the reach of Chinese regulators. What initially appeared to be a modern investment opportunity was, in reality, a large-scale Ponzi scheme, one that relied entirely on new funds to maintain the illusion of success. The total amount taken ran into billions of yuan, a figure so large that investigators later struggled to calculate its exact value due to market shifts and the conversion of funds into cryptocurrency. For years, the operation grew unchecked. But by mid-2017, the pattern of complaints, non-payments, and unreturned investments had drawn the attention of Chinese authorities. Investigators began to examine Blue Sky's structure, and the reality of the scheme started to surface. As pressure mounted, Qian acted quickly. Before the inquiry could close in, she left China, traveling under a false identity and taking with her not only the proceeds of the fraud, but the digital keys to one of the largest illicit cryptocurrency holdings ever linked to a single individual. It was a disappearance that marked the end of the scheme in China and the beginning of a much larger investigation that would eventually reach the UK. She traveled first by moped toward the Myanmar border, crossing out of China before moving through Southeast Asia and then onward into Europe. Every stage was designed to keep her ahead of the inquiry, changing locations quickly and avoiding any traceable pattern. By the time officials in China confirmed the scale of the fraud, she was already thousands of miles away. To move freely, she relied on a fake St. Kitts and Nevis passport, using the identity Yadi Zhang. Under that name, she was able to enter countries that would have flagged her real documentation. She arrived in the United Kingdom sometime between July and September 2017, stepping into London as a woman who appeared to be travelling legitimately with substantial personal wealth. Once in the UK, Qian began shaping a new life around the resources she had brought with her. She sought someone who could help her operate without drawing attention, someone who spoke fluent English and could act as her public face. That person became Jian Wen, a former takeaway worker who had been living modestly in Leeds and later East London. Wen moved in with Qian, initially believing she was assisting a successful businesswoman. Very quickly, she became the English-speaking front, handling inquiries, dealing with estate agents, and accompanying Chien across the country and abroad. To maintain her cover, Chien claimed to run an international jewelry business, a story she used repeatedly when questioned about her wealth. In September 2017, using the name Yardi Jiang, she rented a 6-bedroom mansion in Hampstead for £17,333 a month. Officers would later describe how she often remained inside for long periods, sometimes spending up to 20 hours a day in bed with her laptop, quietly managing the digital wallets containing billions in Bitcoin. Her movements outside the house were more deliberate. Alongside Jian Wen, she traveled extensively across Europe, staying in luxury hotels and presenting herself as a high-net-worth investor. These trips served a purpose. Each journey allowed her to transfer Bitcoin, convert it into cash, or purchase high-value items that could be moved discreetly. One example, later highlighted in court, involved a visit to Zurich, where she and the Wen spent £119,200 on 2 watches in a single transaction. The property market became another avenue for her attempts to legitimize her wealth. Chien viewed multi-million-pound homes across Europe, exploring options in the UK and abroad. These visits were not simply about finding a place to live, they were opportunities to channel large amounts of cryptocurrency into assets that looked stable and conventional. The first major break in the UK came when Chien attempted to turn a portion of her cryptocurrency into a tangible asset. In 2018, she tried to purchase a £12.5 million property in London, using Wen as the English-speaking front for the deal. At first, the process moved smoothly, but as the required Know Your Customer checks progressed, concerns grew about the origin of the funds. The explanations offered, including the supposed jewelry business, did not align with the scale of the money involved. Estate agents alerted the authorities, and the wealth behind the offer was formally flagged as suspicious. That notification triggered the beginning of the UK's involvement in what would become a world record investigation. On 31st October 2018, Metropolitan Police officers attended the Hampstead mansion to execute a search warrant. They found Chien in bed, telling officers she was unwell and presenting herself under the false identity Yardi Jiang. At that point, police had no idea who she really was, nor the scale of the assets she controlled. What they did find were multiple electronic devices, including laptops holding vast quantities of Bitcoin. One device contained a wallet, valued at approximately £823 million, and another held around £350 million. Officers had never encountered cryptocurrency holdings of that magnitude inside a private residence. Despite what they discovered, Chien was not arrested. Police did not yet understand the full significance of the wallets, nor the international fraud that lay behind them. Without that context, they treated the matter as a financial inquiry, rather than the exposure of one of the largest Bitcoin seizures in the world. The search concluded and the investigation continued, but Chien did not wait. Shortly after the raid, aware that the authorities had stepped closer than ever, she simply disappeared. For nearly 6 years, she remained beyond reach, moving quietly across the UK, Scotland, and parts of Europe, always choosing routes and destinations that reduced the risk of detection. She avoided countries with extradition agreements and relied heavily on car travel, knowing that road crossings offered fewer checks and fewer questions than airports or official borders. During this period, a new figure took on a crucial role in keeping her concealed: Seng Hock Ling, a Malaysian national living in the UK. Ling arranged accommodation, often through Airbnbs and private rentals, ensuring Chien could relocate frequently without leaving a clear trail. He handled logistics, day-to-day essentials, and purchases, acting as the buffer between Chien and the outside world. Police later described how properties linked to Ling were used to house not only Chien, but also individuals who worked for her, providing cooking, cleaning, and shopping, while maintaining strict boundaries around her presence. The first major disruption came in May 2021, when Jian Wen was arrested at the Hampstead address and subsequently charged with money laundering. Wen's trial opened a clearer window into Qian's world, revealing inconsistencies in the jewelry business cover story and exposing spending that did not match any legitimate income. But the decisive breakthrough came later. As Wen's trial progressed, investigators detected movement within one of Qian's Bitcoin wallets, a shift that pointed to a new location. Tracing that activity led them to an address in York, connected to Seng Hock Ling. It was the first concrete lead in years, and it brought police closer than they had ever been to finding the woman who had successfully avoided them since 2018. In April 2024, acting on the new intelligence uncovered during Wen's trial, Metropolitan Police officers travelled to York to search a property linked to Seng Hock Ling. When officers entered the address, they found a scene strikingly similar to the one they had encountered in 2018. Qian was discovered hiding in bed, covered up, offering little explanation and presenting herself with the same detached calm she had shown years earlier. Inside the property were 4 other individuals, each carrying out roles that kept Qian shielded from day-to-day exposure. During the search, officers seized several devices. One laptop contained a cryptocurrency wallet valued at approximately £27.3 million in Bitcoin, a substantial amount on its own, but only a small fragment of the total holdings linked to her. As the investigation progressed, police realized the wallet was connected to the earlier discovery of 61,000 Bitcoin, the vast collection of cryptocurrency first identified during the 2018 Hampstead raid. With Bitcoin prices fluctuating over the years, the combined value represented one of the largest seizures of digital assets ever recorded globally. With all this, it became the largest cryptocurrency seizure in UK history and is believed to be among the largest confirmed crypto seizures in the world. With Bitcoin's value fluctuating dramatically, estimates of the haul have ranged from £4.8 billion to more than £5.5 billion. Inside her notebooks were detailed personal ambitions, written in a way that suggested long-term planning rather than passing thoughts. Among them was her intention to become the monarch of Liberland, a self-proclaimed microstate located on a small patch of land between Croatia and Serbia. The notes outlined not only her desire for the title, but also the structures she imagined establishing once in power. Alongside that, she had written about being recognized as a reincarnated goddess, positioning herself as a figure of spiritual authority with followers and ceremonial influence. The documents described plans for a Buddhist temple, an airport, and a port, all proposed features of a state she believed she could shape. One entry mentioned a crown valued at £5 million, part of the image she intended to present if her ambitions ever materialized. Qian was arrested at the scene and taken into custody. During interviews, she offered minimal responses, mostly replying with no comment and maintaining her position of innocence. When the case finally reached court, she pleaded guilty to 2 key offences: possessing criminal property and transferring criminal property. In response, the court imposed a sentence of 11 years and 8 months for controlling assets worth billions. Her assistant, Seng Hock Ling, was sentenced to 4 years and 11 months after pleading guilty to transferring criminal property. Jian Wen had already been convicted in a separate trial and received 6 years and 8 months. What do you think about the cases and the sentences? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your take. And if you found this breakdown informative, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next episode of UK crime documentaries.